Hello, and welcome this time to the considerations for the 25th Sunday of the year. The first reading coming from the book of Isaiah, chapter 55, verses 6 through 9. The second reading from the letter of Paul to the Philippians, chapter 1, verse 20c, then verse 24, then verse 27a. There's a little bit of skipping around that goes on there. And this time from Matthew chapter 20, verse 1 through 16a. Now, you remember that last week we ended chapter 18, and now we move to chapter 20. So you might wonder what has happened to chapter 19. And so before we get to where we're going this time, because remember I continually hope that we get an overview of the whole of Matthew's story, look a little bit of what is left out, or rather what happens in chapter 19. Some of that material has already been discussed in the sections that are brought to our attention from Mark, or from Luke. But nevertheless, Matthew has his own take on things. This section deals with questions of divorce, celibacy, and children. This would be, first of all, found in verses 1 through 15 of chapter 19. Jesus is pictured as having left Galilee and has come into the region across the Jordan. This would be a region that often would be avoided by because it was the territory of the Samaritans, and the Pharisees would have been encouraged in this regard. Verse 3 begins by asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife in any way? Now, keep in mind that the response that Jesus gives to this question is that he goes to the book of Genesis. He goes to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, and then Genesis 2, verse 24, and points out that it's God's intention from the creation for a man and woman to remain united. So he sets up an ideal here, which certainly is important to keep in mind. But it was, and this point is brought out, that a man could get a bill of divorce from his wife. Now, notice that the word bill is used here. That would be a written document. He had to write out the reasons why he was divorcing his wife, give that to the woman, so that then she would be eligible if a second marriage were, or another marriage to her marriage to another person could take place. The concern here is the possibility of remarriage. In other words, a man divorces his wife, then later on wants to marry her again. That's where the issue is raised here. Matthew certainly presents Jesus' teaching, but offers what is known as an exception. Except for, and here is where translation of the word paroia varies. Now, what we hear, I think, in the text that we're going to listen to, except for sexual irregularity, and therefore marries another, commits adultery. So it is true that adultery or marriage, you remember, often takes place between close kins in Jewish life. And that's why this second marriage would be forbidden. It all has to do with something that is extremely cultural in Jewish life. And I mention this because certainly later Christian teaching takes the words of Jesus here, and there is certainly a value and importance here, But as we've been noticing, and which I would continue to kind of stress, it's important to keep the context, the cultural context of these things in mind. Divorce is, as I mentioned, is really arguing against a second marriage to the same woman after she has been married to someone else. So you really have to go get all of that. And I don't think we often think of that when we talk about taking Jesus' words about togetherness, the context in which this issue had developed within Jewish life. We've mentioned this before, that even when writing that bill of divorce and putting her in her hand and casting her out, as it were, out of his house, she is free to marry someone else. The reason for giving this bill of divorce were varied, and we are aware of the fact that there were two basic schools that had developed around this time. One was the school of Shammai, Shammei, who said that for a bill of divorce to be done or given, it had to truly be something shameful. Now, as we mentioned before, what exactly was that? But there were very strict reasons why a bill of divorce could be granted. School of Hillel, Hillel, argued that the reasons for giving a bill of divorce could be lighter. So, and some of the examples are even given. If a wife spoils a dish for her husband, that is, she makes a bad meal, might be a reason for granting divorce. Or she speaks too loudly so that the neighbor next door hears it and is disturbed, might be grounds for divorce. Now, talk about light, okay? And we do find some of these in the Mishnah, although the Mishnah is really put together only 100 years or so after the Christian tradition, so it wouldn't have been really operative as such in Jesus' time, although the teaching may well have been known, and the reasons therefore given. All right, so all of that it gives rise to a question that one of the disciples says, well, then maybe it's better not to marry. I mean, if you're going to have all these problems, and this also, by the way, we've mentioned this before, what would happen if you had a Gentile convert who wished to become Christian, who were in such forbidden marriages? Would they have to divorce to enter the community? So you see how complicated it really became in terms of the dynamics of the time in which this was done. Well, you do have the teaching of Rabbi Eliezer, who said this: any Jew who does not have a wife is not a man. So you have to understand that marriage was considered to be just a normal and a necessary part of human relationships as women and men grew up. But were there those who were unable to have children, or for whatever reason? Certainly we have the instance of the eunuch. We've mentioned that before. Eunuchs were those who were in the court generally of queens or women, and one of the reasons why they were really castigated was that therefore there would be no opportunity in any way for them to cause a conception to take place. There is some example of those who have voluntarily chosen, and this is the issue of celibacy, voluntarily chosen not to enter into marriage. And there is some evidence of this coming from the works that we find down at the community of Qumran. Remember, in the famous scrolls known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there is that situation. All right. So all of that is kind of material that's developed in the first 15 verses. Verses 16 through 20 talk about of chapter 19, the dangers of wealth. It begins by a young man coming up to Jesus and saying to him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit the kingdom?" Well, Jesus asks, well, what are you doing? Keep the commandments. Now, interestingly, he asks an interesting question, the young man. Which one? Well, and then there are some which are cited. Well, what's important is it's not a question of which one. They were all supposed to be kept equally. So in a certain way, the question is kind of, well, you figure that out. But Jesus then goes on to say, well, there's one more thing, that if you really would want to be perfect, if you really want, sell what you have and go follow me. Well, it's pictured as the young man leaving because he had many possessions. Now, keep in mind that in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament, riches were considered to be a sign of God's blessing. So yes, there were concerns about how one used one's wealth, but being wealthy itself was not considered to be wrong, and that's really a little, of course, we have the difficulty then. You mean poor people are not done what they should and are being punished because they're not given the material goods of this world? Well, no, and we have to be certainly careful about how that's understood. And then Jesus is pictured as the young man has left. Verses 23 and 24 says that it's easier for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than it is for one who is rich. Now, that, of course, is really, think of what the eye of a needle and the size of a camel. If that doesn't get your attention, then what would? Now, some have tried to explain that there was a entrance into the city of Jerusalem known as the camel's entrance, or needle's eye. There is no such thing. That's an exact, that it never existed, and whoever interpreted this passage just kind of used that. But the point is that it's very difficult, and it's important to use the gifts of wealth, material possessions, well for the sake of others. Verse 26 through 30 then of chapter 19 pictures Peter saying, well, what about us? We've left everything to follow me, and Jesus says we'll receive 100-fold and eternal life. Now, this, of course, has to do with what we call eschatological look, something that moves always into the future. So that, quickly, is what goes on in chapter 19 of the Gospel. We come now to the chapter that we're looking at, 20, and this is the story. Again, it's another parable. Remember that Jesus likes parables, described in different ways. This might be described as the parable of the generous landowner. It is a parable that is peculiar to Matthew's Gospel. We do not find it in any of the other traditions. And some say that in order to, why is this parable here and how should we understand it, might remember that it is bookended by the saying, and the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Now that's one way to interpret this parable. I'm just saying it's one way. It's not universally agreed that that is what the meaning of the parable, or how the meaning of the parable should be taken, but nevertheless, I mentioned this so that you can see what we call the bookend effect here of this phrase, or this, remember, which is used in the other Gospels and applied by those writers according to their own needs or concerns. All right, the parable breaks down into two major parts. It pictures the landowner going out in the early hour of the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He comes out, now this would probably be around 6 in the morning. Remember, the days begin really at sun up, sunrise, and would be concluded by sunset. But generally, in a nice pattern that works here, it's 12 hours of the day and 12 hours of the night. So it begins at 6 when he hires, that is the owner, hires certain workers and says, I will give you the just pay. I will give you what is expected for a day's work. All right, so, and this is a process of hiring day laborers. Now, keep in mind that some men, and we presume that they were only men who were these workers here, were often very seasonal because they were only going to be hired when the crop was ready to be harvested. In this case, you have a vineyard. So you're going to need, and keep this in mind, you're going to need enough workers to get the grapes in quickly before anything happened to them, particularly if there were any weather change, that could be dangerous. So the time frame for getting the harvest was limited, all right? So he hires these workers, and they go out, day laborers go out into his vineyard. Now, a just wage or a day's wage would have probably been a denarius, and they agreed to, and here's the point to notice as we begin, they agreed to this wage. Now, as the parable continues, the owner goes out again at the 9th hour, which would be 9 o'clock in the morning, the 3rd hour, the 6th hour at noon, and at the 9th hour at 3 in the afternoon. And each time sends workers into his vineyard and says to them, I will give you what is just. Now, notice it's a little different than to say, giving you what is an agreed upon wage, but I will give you a just wage. Now, obviously here, and this is, as we point out, the owner, who is a rich man, would really not be generally the one who would do this. A manager would be the one who would hire the necessary workers. But here, for the sake of making this an interesting story, it is the owner himself who does the hiring. The day laborers, as I mentioned, would congregate in a marketplace. Each would be hoping to be hired, and they would work when there was a work to be done. Now, when he goes out at these different times of the day and sends the workers into his vineyard to continue in the harvest, one might say, well, there are a couple questions that are raised here. Why does he have to go out at the 3rd, at the 6th, and the 9th hour to hire more Why didn't he just send a whole bunch at once? Did he miscalculate? Did he think that the ones that he had hired would be able to handle it? Was the vineyard bigger and the crop greater than he had anticipated? And therefore, knowing that the great gathering had to take place quickly, need more work. Now, when he goes out, and here's the end of the parable, goes out at what's called the 11th hour. Now, keep in mind, as we've been talking about, would have been about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, finds some men still standing in the marketplace and says, "Why are you standing here idle?" Well, they say to him, "Because no one has hired us." And he says, "Well, you go to and work in the vineyard." All right, so obviously they are only going to be working, if you kind of put things together here, they are only going to be working 1 hour. All right, now the day is done. All the workers come in from the field. We hope that they have gathered as much of the harvest of grapes as they could. Whether they're complete or not, whether there will be work the next day that needs to be done, is not told in the parable, because now the parable in verses 8 through 15 comes to the payment. And the owner says to the manager, now who will be paying the workers, "Start with those who were hired last and pay them first." And those who were hired last were given the full day's pay. Now, it's very interesting, isn't it? Very generous. So that when, and you can kind of imagine them kind of standing in line. Now, we're not quite sure what those who were hired at the 9th, at the 6th, and at the 3rd hour were paid. But when it comes to those who were hired first, they expect that, look, this guy's given a full day's pay to those who worked 1 hour. We should be getting more, should we not? After all, we have borne, and they later on will tell him, the sun and the heat of the day, but instead what they get is simply the same wage. And after all, that's what they had agreed to, the just wage of 1 day. And so they grumble. And now, before you're too quick to pass judgment here, perhaps you might feel the same way. After all, if this guy is demonstrating generosity, why is the line of generosity been drawn that they don't get the benefit of it, okay? So I just kind of say that. He argues with them, look, that is those who grumble him, who have worked all day. Look, I gave you the just wage. That's what you agreed upon. What's the problem? Now, are you envious of me because I am kind, because I am generous? And certainly it kind of ends there. And here's where that quote again, "The last shall be first and the first shall be last." But wait a minute. Is this now, and here's a question that might be raised, and why this is often a somewhat controversial parable in how it is resolved. Does justice mean being paid what others are paid for the same amount of work? Or does justice mean being paid the exact amount that you have agreed upon? So, you see, if it's that latter part, well, that's what the owner says. You agreed on it. I gave it to you. I'm not being unjust. So go home. Now, whether they would come back to work again the next day, if there was work to be done, that we don't know. So the parable certainly does address the resentment felt by those who had spent long This is what I kind of wanted to say. Is the parable, now how does it apply to the community of Matthew? Keep in mind that Matthew is crafting these parables to deal with the circumstances of his community. Is the parable addressed to the resentment felt by those who had spent long years in faithful observance of the Torah, at the welcome and acceptance of Jesus, who gave those, brought them in? And does Jesus, therefore, kind of give the same privileges and honor to those who are later in coming in, or are being converted to the message of Jesus? So you can see, that's not fair. And importantly, notice this isn't a question of fairness. It's a question about justice. And rightly, when you kind of analyze this, justice is done, but the point is that in God's realm, and this might be the teaching here, should mean, if you're going to be just, everyone should be fed. Now, keep in mind the concern for those who are the less fortunate. If those men who were standing around all day till the 5th hour could not get a job, their family that night most likely would go hungry. See, this is what we need to see, that a denarius was enough for a single day's meal. If they had families and they couldn't get a job, then their family would go hungry. So from that point of view, see, if we keep in mind the ongoing concern to care for the poor and the needy, then this is what this parable exemplifies, that the owner, by paying the fellow who worked 1 hour the full day's wage, would be able to get enough food again to feed his family that day. And so here is another way of understanding justice. Justice is that everyone should be and are considered to be equal, not only in God's grace, certainly that's true, we're all equal in God's eyes, but also in fellow humans' eyes. Now, whether that would be truly appreciated, I suppose, is something you'd have to consider. All right, well, yes, everyone deserves a good meal, but look, if you don't work for it, you don't deserve it. But on the other hand, if there's no opportunity to work, then how can you really appreciate getting something to eat? So there's another, just kind of as we're concluding this, another point to keep in mind, that God's generosity knows no limits. God is concerned that all are equally treated. This parable, in that sense, might be, again, a little bit of response, and that's why I go back to chapter 19, which we have seen before, how wealth is used, how the goods of this world are to be distributed in an equal and fair way. Is this parable indicating that that's one of the messages here? That although we are all given opportunities, humanly, some more than others, to earn, we are all entitled to those things which we need in order to survive, particularly on a daily basis. So in that sense, is not the owner being just in what he does? So it is a question of justice. It needs to be we need to continue to struggle with that and look at that. Again, let me thank you for being with us, and we hope to see you